The night was quiet in Washington, D.C., unusually quiet. J.D. Vance, Vice President of the United States, sat alone in his private study. The fire crackled in the hearth behind him, but he barely noticed. On his desk lay an envelope. No return. Address, no stamp. Just his name. Typed in small block letters, J.D. Vance. He had found it on his doorstep 2 hours ago. He had ignored it at first, figured it was another anonymous letter from a supporter or critic. But something about the clean, deliberate way his name was printed made him curious. Now as he peeled back the seal, he felt the temperature in the room drop. Inside were 3 things. First, a thin stack of photocopied documents, stamped classified in red. Second, a small black USB stick with a red mark scratched across the casing. Third, a note handwritten, hurried, and slightly smudged. It read, "She's not who you think she is." He read it 3 times. His eyes slowly moved back to the word she. There was only one she that mattered right now, Justice Helen Whitaker, the Supreme Court Justice, scheduled to speak in front of the Senate Judiciary Committee in just 5 days. The hearing was supposed to be routine a speech about the role of law in protecting democracy. Now it seemed anything but routine. J.D. Vance sat back, gripping the USB stick tightly in one hand while his other hovered over the phone. Oh man, was real, it could mean the most powerful woman on the nation's highest court had ties to foreign money. If it was fake, even opening it could ruin his reputation. He dialed a name he trusted. "It's Tara Mitchell," he said into the phone. "It's urgent. I need you at the residence. Now." Sarah Mitchell was more than just a journalist. She had spent a decade uncovering deep state secrets, corruption in both parties, and had once been threatened by the CIA for exposing illegal surveillance. She didn't ask questions over the phone. She simply said, "On my way." 40 minutes later, Sarah arrived. She wore a dark trench coat, her curly hair tied back, and a small laptop bag slung over her shoulder. Vance didn't waste time. With greetings, he slid the USB across the table. "Can you scan it? See if it's real." She inserted the USB into her laptop and began the scan. Her fingers moved fast, her eyes narrowing as lines of code scrolled across the screen. Paused. Military-grade encryption. Whoever made this didn't want it falling into the wrong hands. Vance leaned forward. "Can you break it?" Sarah didn't answer. Instead, she made a call. Within the hour, a quiet knock echoed through the vice president's hall. Sarah opened the door to reveal a young man in his 30s, thin and pale, with intense eyes and a laptop under his arm. "Ethan Cole," she said. "Former NSA systems architect. K. Left after blowing the whistle on surveillance overreach. He's the best shot we've got." Ethan said nothing, just nodded and got to work. 2 hours later, the files opened. There were emails. Hundreds. Between an aide of Justice Whitaker and an executive from a progressive international fund. Discussions of campaign donations. Promises to ensure friendly interpretations of climate litigation. Even suggestions of coordinating narratives through academic forums and legal journals. But what made J.D. Vance's blood run cold was a single sentence from an email dated 2 weeks before Whitaker's nomination. "Whitaker is aligned. Our interests will be protected. The court will follow." He stared at the line, unable to speak. Sarah looked at him. "You understand what this means, right? This could compromise a sitting Supreme Court justice. It's the trust of the public. The foundation of our judicial system. It could all unravel," Ethan added. "The metadata checks out. Nothing faked." This was typed on a secure server. "These emails are real." J.D. Vance stood and walked to the window. The city lights of Washington sparkled below, but everything felt darker now. He was a public servant. He believed in the system even when it was flawed. But this felt like betrayal. "Do we go public?" Sarah asked. Vance shook his head slowly. "Not yet. We do it where it counts, where no one can run. It's on record." Liv, he turned to them, his voice calm but firm. "I'm taking this to the judiciary hearing. In front of the Senate, in front of the American people. Ethan looked unsure. Are you ready for the blowback? If you're wrong, I'm not wrong, Vance interrupted. And if I stay silent, I'm complicit. The three of them stood there in silence. In the background, a news broadcast continued on mute, showing footage of Justice Whittaker arriving at her chambers. She looked calm, composed. But now J.D. Vance knew she wasn't who the country thought she was. And in 5 days, the entire world would know too. The moment J.D. Vance finished speaking, a wave of silence swept over the courtroom. The red file he had placed on the table seemed to glow under the camera lights, its confidential stamp now burned into the memory of every person in the room. Senators leaned in. Reporters whispered behind lifted hands. Justice Whittaker sat motionless, like stone, but her eyes flicked once toward the document. Chairman Coleman cleared his throat. Vice President Vance, the claims you've just made verified, could shake the Supreme Court to its core. Are you prepared to submit this evidence officially? J.D. nodded without hesitation. Yes, and there's more. He gestured to a tall man standing at the back of the room. A quiet figure in a dark jacket stepped forward, carrying a sleek black briefcase. He placed it on the table, opened it, and slid a small hard drive to the chairman. This, J.D. said, contains original emails, time-stamped chats, and digital signatures from the Progressive Fund's private server. It was leaked anonymously. We had it verified by a cyber forensic team. Senator Clara Hensley leaned forward, eyebrows raised. Mr. Vice President, you're suggesting that a Supreme Court justice, a sitting justice, was part of a scheme to influence rulings in exchange for political alignment. J.D. didn't blink. I'm not suggesting. I'm showing you. Justice Whittaker finally spoke, her voice low but steady. I refuse to respond to unnamed sources and unverifiable files. If this body allows such tactics, every judge in this nation becomes vulnerable to manipulation. J.D. turned toward her. I agree, which is why the names and IP signatures in those files match real donors, real exchanges. And one message from your former clerk Richard Bell directly references you as the linchpin of our judicial firewall. Gasps rippled through the room. Richard Bell, a well-known clerk turned federal judge, had always been loyal to Whittaker. The name alone raised new alarm. Senator Wilkes held up the hard drive. We'll send this to federal IT experts for immediate review. Until then, Justice Whittaker, I suggest you remain available to this panel. She nodded once, jaw tight. Chairman Coleman looked at the clock. This hearing is now recessed for 48 hours, pending analysis of the files. We will reconvene at the same location. Until then, this matter is under full legal confidentiality. As the room began to empty, J.D. caught the eye of investigative journalist Sarah Mitchell, sitting in the gallery. She gave him a subtle nod. She had been the first to see the documents, the one who risked her career to verify them. Back in his office, J.D. stood by the window with his wife, Yusha, watching the sun sink behind the Capitol dome. You realize this will start a war, don't you? She said softly. It already has. He replied, I'm just turning on the lights. Down the hall, Democratic senators gathered in whispers. Some were panicked, others skeptical. Senator Hensley stared at a printed email from the leak. The language was precise, coded, but readable. She was too careful, she muttered. This ... doesn't make sense. Behind closed doors, Whittaker sat with her legal team. Her former clerk, Richard Bell, had gone silent, his phone turned off, his calendar wiped clean. She stared at a single message on her private device. No sender ID, just for words. They know. Stay quiet. Whittaker closed the screen and folded her hands. The mask she wore in public was gone now. In its place, fear. But J.D. wasn't finished. That night, he appeared on national television for a special live interview. The host, Raymond Holt, didn't waste time. "Mr. Vice President," he began, "you've accused a Supreme Court justice of secret dealings with political networks tied to foreign money. How far does this go?" JD looked directly into the camera. "As far as we're willing to follow it." "And will the president support a full investigation?" JD paused. "The president believes in the rule of law. And so do I. If corruption has reached the highest court, it's not just about one justice. It's about the system itself." Social media exploded. Hashtag judicial crisis trended globally. Whitaker leaks filled feeds across platforms. Public trust, already hanging by a thread, had just snapped. Meanwhile, far away from Washington, a private jet touched down in Zurich. A man stepped off, pulling a black coat tight against the cold. He looked at the message on his phone. "Whitaker's wall is cracking." He smiled. Inside the Capitol, J.D. Vance looked out across the empty hearing room. He knew what came next would not just test the law, but the very soul of the Republic. And the clock was ticking. The courtroom was frozen in silence. No one moved. Even the hum of background whispers had faded. J.D. Vance stood firmly at the witness table, a printed transcript of the recorded conversation still in his hand. Across from him, Justice Whitaker stared ahead, her expression unreadable, but a slight tremor in her hand gave her away. Chairman Coleman adjusted his glasses and looked toward the other senators. "This hearing is not a trial," he said slowly. "But the implications here could redefine the standards of judicial accountability in this country." He motioned to one of the aides, who dimmed the lights and projected a set of encrypted emails onto the large screen behind the panel. The room was dead quiet as the first email loaded. It was from an executive of the Progressive Leadership Fund to a private account traced to a known associate of Whitaker. Subject line: "Timeline aligned." The message was brief but chilling. "With confirmation moving forward, we should prepare groundwork for anticipated rulings. Voting rights early summer. Klimafall, she's on board." Senator Cruz sat up straighter. That email implies coordination before Justice Whitaker was even sworn in. He said aloud, his voice carrying force, "This isn't just unethical lied borders on a conspiracy to interfere with judicial independence." Senator Clara Hensley, flanked by two Democratic colleagues, raised a hand. "I ask again, do we have any direct communication from Justice Whitaker herself? Emails, signed memos, anything indisputable?" J.D. Vance took out a slim leather folder from his case. "We do," he said. "We believe this message was sent using a burner phone tied to her assistant. It's been authenticated by cyber forensic analysts." He placed the transcript on the overhead projector. A brief WhatsApp message blinked into view. "Ensure vote language aligns. Push economic equity framework to back it. No deviation. We'll handle Roberts if needed." The air shifted. The name Roberts hit the room like a thunderclap. Chief Justice John Roberts. The message implied a strategy to sway the entire court's direction and possibly manipulate its highest authority. Justice Whitaker finally leaned forward. "This is a stretch," she said firmly. "Burner phones, unverifiable sources, political timing, it all adds up to one thing: a calculated takedown." She looked directly at Vance. "I see what this is. You're trying to reframe the court before the next election. Undermine its credibility. You can't win at the ballot box, so you try to discredit the bench." But J.D. Vance didn't flinch. "You can call it political," he replied, his voice steady. "But the American people deserve to know if the law is being traded behind closed doors." Senator Hensley stood again, agitated. "These are accusations without a formal investigation. Till we have a court order or committee approval, we should not be discussing classified files or sealed communications in an open hearing." But she was interrupted. A man in the second row stood up, mid-30s, wearing a faded blazer and jeans. He was holding a press badge rolling wire investigative desk. "Mr. Chairman," he called out, "I have something that might shift this." Hearing further, the room tensed. Coleman narrowed his eyes. "Who are you?" "Thomas Ray, journalist. I received a copy of the same cache Vance holds from a separate source." Senators turned. Whitaker's jaw visibly tensed. Cameras flashed. Ray held up a flash drive. "But mine has something else. A video file." The aides rushed forward. Within minutes, the room darkened again. The video loaded. It showed a conference room, dimly lit, security footage time-stamped 6 months prior. In the frame, Justice. Whitaker sat across from two unnamed individuals. The conversation had no audio, but one of the men handed her a blue folder identical to the one J.D. Vance now held. There was no context, no sound, but the visual was damning. Justice Whitaker leaned back in her chair in the footage, nodded once, and tapped the folder with a pen. Her lips moved. The screen froze on that moment. The crowd inside the chamber erupted, some gasping, others whispering furiously. It wasn't hard evidence, but it was visual proof of contact and possession of classified political materials. It was more than most scandals ever had. Chairman Coleman looked dazed. "We need a closed-door recess," he said abruptly. "And an emergency inquiry vote immediately." Justice Whitaker stood, not waiting for approval. "I won't be. Tried in a hearing like this," she snapped. "This is a setup and I won't give it credibility by staying." She stormed out of the chamber as the room descended into chaos. J.D. Vance remained standing, unmoved. The headlines were already being written, but what would come next? It would be far bigger than he had planned. Cameras swarmed the marble steps of the Capitol. Reporters shouted questions. News, helicopters hovered above, and the media spin machine roared into full speed. The words "judicial crisis" were already trending on every platform. J.D. Vance remained inside, still standing, still calm. Chairman Coleman called a 30-minute recess, giving the committee time to privately review the new video evidence. Security escorted Justice Whitaker out through a side exit. Her face, once unshakable, was pale under the corridor lights. Inside the closed committee room, the mood shifted. Less show, more strategy. Senator Hensley spoke first. "I still believe we must proceed carefully. If this hearing leads to a judicial inquiry, it will fracture public trust in the court for decades." Ted Cruz leaned forward, sharp. "What's worse, exposing corruption or ignoring it?" Vance didn't speak yet. He let them argue, let them show their hands. Some senators wanted to bury the scandal. Others wanted blood. But Vance didn't care about headlines, cared about what came next. Finally, he stood. "I'm not looking for a political win," he said plainly, "but we must protect the integrity of the court, or there's no America left to argue about." Senator Marshall, a moderate, asked what many were thinking. But why now? Why this moment? Vance hesitated, then opened a new folder from his briefcase. Because this wasn't just about climate policy or voting rights. This wasn't domestic. He passed the folder to the center of the table. Inside were photos, bank transfers, a flagged connection between the Progressive Leadership Fund and a foreign-based entity known only in intel circles. SOA, a covert influence group suspected of interfering in political institutions across Europe and South America. Several senators leaned forward in shock. Senator Hensley's face darkened. "Are you saying foreign money made its way into the confirmation process?" "I'm saying," Vance said, "that our Supreme Court may have been compromised not just politically, but globally." The room fell silent again. Chairman Coleman slowly leaned back. "Then this isn't just a Senate hearing anymore?" Back in the main chamber, the crowd had grown restless. Security had doubled. Reporters were now openly speculating about impeachment, resignations, even a constitutional crisis. The doors opened again, and the senators returned to their seats. J.D. Vance stepped to the microphone. "I apologize for the delay," Chairman Coleman said to the public. "But new evidence has raised urgent national security concerns. This Hearing is now under provisional review by the Intelligence Oversight Committee. Gasps in the crowd. Then Vance spoke deliberate, composed. The evidence we've gathered suggests that Justice Whitaker's financial and advisory connections go beyond U.S. borders, if verified. This would mark the first known case of a Supreme Court justice's influence being shaped by a foreign-backed group. Reporters bolted for their phones. Live tweets exploded. But it wasn't over. From the gallery, a new figure stood up. Middle-aged glasses. Tweed jacket anonymous except for the badge clipped to his collar. "Mr. Vance," he called out, "if you want proof, this goes deeper. I have it." Security hesitated, but Coleman waved him forward. The man introduced himself as Professor Alan Dresner, a former cybersecurity consultant who had worked with multiple intelligence subcontractors before retiring early. He had come forward after recognizing one of the encryption patterns used in the leaked messages. "What you're dealing with," Dresner said, placing a drive on the table, "is part of something called Operation Ledgerlight. It was a digital pipeline, a quiet influence funnel. Its fingerprints are all over these emails, these transactions." The senators were stunned. None of this was supposed to come out in public. Chairman Coleman paused, his voice low but clear. "Then we must reconvene in classified session immediately." J.D. Vance nodded. But just as Coleman began closing the hearing, a staffer rushed in with a folded note. He handed it to Coleman, who read it, his face drained of color. He cleared his throat and looked around. "We have a situation. Justice Whitaker has just been taken into protective custody by federal agents." The room exploded in sound. Cameras flashed, people shouted. Reporters ran toward the exits, their phones lighting up. J.D. Vance stayed still, watching the chaos unfold around him. He didn't smile, he didn't speak. Say, because he knew what was coming next. This wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. J.D. Vance stepped out of the hearing chamber and into a world that had shifted beneath his feet. Reporters were everywhere. Security pushed back the crowds, but the air buzzed with panic and fury. On every news channel, pundits screamed. Supreme Court crisis. Justice Whitaker detained. Foreign interference confirmed. The words crawled across screens like warning lights. But J.D. didn't stop for cameras. He was already thinking ahead about what still hadn't been revealed. Inside his briefcase was one final folder. Not shown to the Senate. Not yet. Usha, his wife and legal partner, waited for him near the exit. Her phone was pressed to her ear. "They just froze Whitaker's accounts," she whispered. "Ethan's decrypting the offshore links." Vance gave a nod. "We move now." They climbed into a black SUV and drove straight to an underground secure facility outside Arlington. Waiting for them was Ethan Cole, a hacker who'd risked everything. Unshaven, hoodie up. He sat in front of 4 monitors flickering with data maps and IP traces. "I cracked the second layer," Ethan said. "It's bad." He pointed to an open document, a spreadsheet. "Payments," Vance muttered. "Through a shell corporation registered in Cyprus," Ethan replied. "Same. Funding network used in interference cases in Brazil and Hungary." And this, Usha pointed to a second file. "Draft legal briefs," Ethan said grimly. "Prepared before Whitaker ever ruled on any case. Word for with her opinions." Silence filled the bunker. Vance sat down slowly. This was no longer about one corrupt deal. This was a long-term infiltration. Meanwhile, back in Washington, Justice Whitaker sat in a sealed interview room surrounded by 3 federal agents. She hadn't requested a lawyer. She stared at the wall, her hands folded. On the table in front of her, a playback device and a printout of a decrypted message. The message read, "Confirmation ensured. RW is secure. Rulings will align with global progress benchmarks. RW Ruth Whitaker." Her fingers tightened. "I never agreed to this," she finally said. The lead agent leaned forward. "Then tell us who did." Across the country, the public was melting down. On Capitol Hill, half the Senate called for immediate impeachment hearings. Others called it a coup against the judiciary. Social media was an inferno. One side claimed J.D. Vance was a hero. The other said he was staging a MAGA rebellion. But Vance wasn't watching. He was preparing for the final reveal. He called Sarah Mitchell, the investigative journalist who had first helped verify the documents. "I need you to publish this anonymously," he said, emailing her the redacted files. "Let the people know the court's been compromised for years." She paused. "You realize if I do this, I'll be hunted?" He answered quietly. "Then we'll protect you." Mitchell clicked publish. Within minutes, the documents were live. Funding trails, message logs, legal coordination, evidence, and names. Not just Whitaker, but 2 more federal judges. A former clerk who now worked as a policy advisor. A senior member of a global nonprofit advisory board. The headline read, "America's Shadow Rulings, What They Never Wanted You to See," and the internet blew up. At the White House, the president called an emergency press briefing. His voice was steady, but his hands trembled. "These are deeply troubling revelations," he said. "We must ensure the integrity of our institutions. I have ordered a special counsel investigation." But behind the podium, whispers grew louder. Even the president's own staff were unsure if more names were coming. That night, Vance received an encrypted message. One line only. "You think? You've won. But Ledgerlight doesn't die." He stared at the screen for a long moment, then looked up at Usha. "They're warning us." "Or daring us," she replied. J.D. rose and walked toward the window of the safe house. Outside, headlights moved slowly up the quiet road. He didn't flinch, because the game had changed. This wasn't politics anymore, it was war, and they had just drawn first blood. 3 black SUVs sped down a rural road outside Arlington, just before dawn. Inside the lead vehicle, J.D. Vance sat in silence, hands clasped tightly together. His mind was racing, but his face was calm. Across from him sat Usha, tablet in hand, scanning the live feeds. On her screen, reports of mass protests forming outside federal courts in New York, San Francisco, and Chicago. The country was boiling. "Too much heat," Usha muttered. "They're going to move against you." J.D. didn't blink. "Let them." "We move first." From the vehicle behind them, Ethan Cole patched in through a secure comms line. They tried to wipe the Ledgerlight servers. "I got in first." "But they're mobilizing now." "Who's they?" J.D. asked. Ethan hesitated. "Connected. Legal lobbies," he said. "Some are American front groups. But the money, it's not just from D.C. Go on." Ethan's voice turned cold. "Germany, Qatar. One in Beijing. They've been quietly feeding money through foundations, think tanks, and media shells creating legal pressure campaigns. So it's bigger than one justice. It's a machine." As the cars approached a secured government compound, a man in a dark overcoat stood waiting. Senator Tom Wilkes, a longtime ally of Vance and chair of the Homeland Integrity Committee. He gave a sharp nod as J.D. stepped out. "You just turned Washington inside out," Wilkes said. "No, I just exposed who really runs it." They entered a dimly lit operations room. On the wall was a projection of a complex map showing links between courts, law schools, nonprofits, and private donors. Red threads crisscrossed. Wilkes stepped forward. "We traced the Ledgerlight name to a secret legal fellowship operating out of a London law firm. They run training programs for young American legal scholars. Scholarships." Usha asked. Wilkes nodded grimly. "That's what they call it, but it's recruitment. They train loyal jurists, feed them into our judicial system. And they've already reached the Supreme Court." J.D. Vance looked at the map. His eyes narrowed. "They're building a shadow bench." Meanwhile, at the Capitol, chaos was in full swing. Senator Clara Hensley and a coalition of progressive lawmakers demanded Vance's arrest for undermining judicial independence. They held an emergency press conference. This is nothing but a far-right operation to destroy trust in our courts, Hensley said into the cameras. Vice President Vance must be removed from office pending investigation. But as she spoke, a low-ranking aide rushed to her side and whispered into her ear. Her face went pale. She paused. "Correction," she said stiffly. "We have just learned that Justice Helen Whitaker has been placed under federal protection and is cooperating with investigators." The press exploded. Justice Whitaker, who had remained silent, was now turning over everything. Back at the secure facility, JD stood before a table full of classified files, intelligence reports, and audio recordings. He turned to Wilkes. "We have names. We have proof. We need indictments." Wilkes raised a brow. "You understand the backlash." "I'm not here for comfort," JD replied. "I'm here to finish this." Later that evening, a pre-recorded video from Vice President Vance was broadcast on every major network. His message was direct. "My fellow Americans, I come to you not as a politician, but as a citizen. What I've uncovered is not political warfare, is the quiet hijacking of our justice system by outside influence and domestic betrayal. This is not about left or right. This is about truth," he continued. "We've turned over all verified documents to the Department of Justice. We've launched a full-scale investigation. I call on all honest officials left, right, and independent to join this effort to cleanse our courts and protect our Constitution." The broadcast sent shockwaves across the globe. In Berlin, government spokespeople denied any involvement. In Doha, denials came quickly, with warnings of political retaliation if Qatar's name was used again. In Beijing, silence. The American people were no longer divided by party lines. They were now divided by one question: who do you trust? And in the dark corners of the judicial world, secret alliances began to unravel. Emails were deleted. Hard drives disappeared. And somewhere in a law office in London, the last surviving director of Ledgerlight made a call to a hidden number. "It's time," he said. "Activate the fallback." Back in the U.S., J.D. Vance stood before a Senate Intelligence Committee, his testimony hours away. Yusha looked at him from across the room. "You know this isn't the end, right?" "No," he said quietly. "It's only the beginning." The hearing chamber was unusually quiet. For once, no cameras, no reporters, just senators, investigators, and Vice President J.D. Vance. Seated under dim light, Senator Daniel Coleman tapped his pen against the desk and leaned forward. "Mr. Vice President, you've already turned over the documents. Justice Whitaker has given her partial cooperation. But what you say next may shape the future of this republic. Are you ready?" J.D. nodded. His voice was calm. "Yes, sir." The double doors creaked open. Into the chamber walked Justice Helen Whitaker, no longer composed and untouchable. Her hair was pulled back, her expression tense. She walked to the table across from J.D. and sat, hands folded. Jaw clenched. She didn't look at him. The committee chair cleared his throat. "This is not a trial. This is a closed federal oversight session. Let the record show Justice Whitaker is present voluntarily." Senator Wilkes leaned in. "Justice Whitaker, we have evidence that implicates foreign money tied to your judicial decisions on matters like climate policy, voting regulations, and international trade. Do you admit to this?" Silence. Her jaw moved slightly. Then, with slow, quiet control, she spoke. "I admit. I made contact with Ledgerlight. I received briefings and support during my nomination process. I never accepted money directly. I never agreed to betray the court." Wilkes pressed, "But your rulings matched their agenda." "I ruled based on my understanding of the law," she shot back. "Yes, I was influenced. I wasn't bought." J.D. spoke now, gently. "Justice Whitaker, do you believe the system you served is still independent?" She looked at him. For the first time, no defense in her eyes. "No," she said, "not entirely." The air in the room changed. Heavy. Honest. JD nodded. "Then help us fix it." He opened a folder and handed it to the chair. Inside were files that went even. Further case decisions from lower courts influenced by similar networks. Connections to lobbying firms. Anonymous donations traced through layered shell companies. Even recordings of private law professors training judges under the cover of academic fellowships. Wilkes read through the pages, his face going pale. "This is a quiet coup," he whispered back outside. The media waited in secret. The White House communications team prepared a national address. President Jenna Reeves had remained silent throughout this scandal, careful not to look partisan. But now, with the facts before her, she had made a decision. That night, she stood before the nation. "My fellow Americans," she began, "the rule of law is sacred. And recent revelations have exposed cracks in its foundation. I have authorized the Department of Justice and the Senate Judiciary Committee to begin a nonpartisan, sweeping investigation into foreign influence and legal corruption at every level of our system." J.D. Vance watched from a private room in the Capitol. "She moved fast," Usha said. "She had to," J.D. replied. "The people demanded it." Meanwhile, in a remote location outside Geneva, Switzerland, Legulite's remaining board members gathered in secrecy. Their network had been exposed, their operations frozen. One of them, a tall man with a silver beard, turned off a secure laptop. "We were careless," he said in a thick accent. "We underestimated the Americans." Another man, younger, asked, "What do we do now?" The elder paused. "We wait. Power always needs a vacuum." But back in the United States, something rare was happening. Republicans and Democrats were forming an emergency coalition to restore judicial transparency across college campuses. Legal scholars debated ethics. Whistleblowers emerged from law firms, speaking anonymously and in courtrooms from Boston to San Diego. Judges reviewed past rulings under public pressure. The foundation had been shaken, yes, but it was being rebuilt, one truth at a time. As for Justice Whitaker, she quietly resigned weeks later. She released a short public statement. "I served the law, but I also served ego. I allowed myself to believe I was helping the system evolve. In truth, I helped it decay. For that, I take responsibility." The message went viral. Not because of blame, but because it was rare. And J.D. Vance. He returned to the Senate one cold morning, stepping through the marble halls with the same calm determination. A reporter asked him, was it worth it? He stopped. "For the Constitution. For the truth," he said. Always. He didn't smile. He didn't need to. Because in a world full of headlines and whispers, one thing had become clear again. The truth, when spoken at the right moment, can still silence even the most powerful. And sometimes it takes one voice to remind a nation of its soul.